The moment Eva found out she wasn't Ted's daughter didn't come from calmly opening a DNA report at a desk. It exploded in the middle of what should have been an ordinary evening at Fairmont Crest, when every emotion in the house was already stretched to its limit. That day, Ted's home had turned into a silent battlefield. The community council was pressuring him over a new investment, and the local press had begun whispering about irregularities in the Dupree family's asset declarations. Vernon was scowling over the numbers, Anita coolly reminding everyone about public image, Nicole standing on the sidelines like a shadow that no longer belonged in this house, and Leslie, as usual, deftly positioned herself at the center of every discussion that involved Ted. In an atmosphere like that, a single spark was enough to burn everything down. That spark was a plain white envelope, buried among the stack of documents Ted's assistant had sent over, something Leslie should have hidden long ago. When Vernon asked about a life insurance policy Ted had taken out for Eva years earlier, the conversation suddenly veered into legal procedures regarding lawful heirs. Eva's name appeared, her birth date appeared, and then a small note about a genetic test was mentioned as if it were some casual question. Ted froze for a second. Leslie instantly changed the subject, but it was precisely that clumsy, panicked deflection that made Anita narrow her eyes. Nicole stare at the files as if she had a bad feeling, and Eva's hand, which had only been resting on the back of her chair, clenched so tightly that her knuckles turned white. The envelope was pulled out because of one unrestrained motion from Vernon when he yanked the stack of papers out of Leslie's hand to read more closely. A thin sheet slipped from the pile and fluttered down onto the stone floor, spinning a few times before lying still, the line about the paternity test clearly visible. No one wanted to be the first to touch it, as if it were some dangerous object about to explode. But then everything happened very fast. Anita bent down, her eyes skimming the numbers as her hand trembled slightly. Nicole caught that expression and took a step forward. Ted moved closer because he couldn't stand being shut out of anything that had to do with Eva. And Eva simply stood there watching, feeling like an intruder in the story of her own life. When the words "no genetic compatibility with the alleged father" appeared, no one had to say anything. The heavy initial silence was quickly torn apart by accusations, questions, ragged breaths. Leslie tried to regain control, denied it, then hurriedly admitted it was just a faulty test, that there had been doubts, that she only wanted to protect everyone. But in that moment, the only thing Eva could hear was a simple, brutal truth. Her entire life had been built on a deliberate lie, and the one pulling the strings was not some stranger, but the woman she had once called mother. Eva didn't cry, didn't scream, didn't smash anything. The shock that washed through her was so immense it never had time to crystallize into anger. It only left behind a hollow emptiness, as if someone had ripped out her insides and thrown them to the bottom of Fairmont's lake. She looked at Ted, waiting for some instinctive reaction, a denial, a step toward her, an arm pulling her close. Ted opened his mouth but only managed a few short, meaningless sentences, then stopped short when his eyes met Nicole's gaze that was pained and cold at the same time, quietly reminding him that it was his blind faith years ago in Eva as God's second gift that had destroyed their marriage. In the moment that demanded a choice, Ted did what he had always done all his life. He stood still, tried to understand everything with his head, tried to postpone feeling until the storm had passed. And that moment passed long before Eva had any desire left to wait. She packed her things in silence like a shadow. The room that had once been piled high with gifts, photographs, and luxury items as proof that Eva is Ted Dupree's daughter now felt alien, like a staged model home instead of a real place lived in. Every object she shoved into her suitcase felt like a piece of evidence for her own crime, the crime of having unknowingly lived like an imposter, even though she herself was only a victim. Ted knew she was packing, Leslie knew, the whole house knew, but no one knew what to say. Ted had walked up to her door, his hand closing around the doorknob before letting go, because his head was full of questions about the media, about the council, about the fallout if he publicly admitted Eva was not his child. He was afraid of losing power, afraid of losing his reputation, afraid of shaking Fairmont to its core, and in that tangle of fears, he forgot that the person standing on the other side of the door was a flesh-and-blood human being crushed by life. He didn't stop her, didn't ask her to stay, didn't say a single word to let her know that even without shared blood, he still saw her as his daughter. That silence was the harshest sentence Eva ever received. Leslie, the one who had created the story that Eva is Ted's daughter, also had the moral veneer she'd carefully worn for years ripped away. Her deepest motives had never been just love, no matter how hard she tried to convince herself. At the beginning, it had been a cold calculation. A single mother with a child trying to carve out a place in the world Ted and Vernon controlled. Turning Eva into Ted's daughter didn't just secure a financial future. It secured Leslie's own position in the power structure around Fairmont Crest. Over time, that lie got braided together with real emotions. Her jealousy toward Nicole, her craving to see Eva stand beside Ted as proof that she, not anyone else, understood him best. She justified it by saying she was giving Eva a better life, giving Ted a chance to atone for the daughter he had lost in the past, giving Nicole a lesson for failing to keep her husband. But when Eva walked out with her suitcase without so much as a backward glance, every reason Leslie had ever clung to suddenly seemed ridiculous. The child she thought she was protecting had been turned into a tool, a chip in a game of power, and now that game was devouring her. Guilt crept in, but Leslie still didn't have the courage to fully own it. She kept telling herself she could fix it later, kept believing Eva would eventually come back, that this was just a bad phase that would pass. Leaving Fairmont Crest, Eva thought that all she had to do was step past the gate and everything behind her would become the past. But Fairmont had sunk too deep into the way she saw the world. In the years that followed, she drifted from city to city, living in temporary rentals, taking short-term jobs, and moving on before anyone could get too familiar. She tried to build a new identity, changed her last name, avoided using Dupree, avoided any bank account or paperwork that could be traced. Yet wherever she went, whenever she reached for something even slightly better, a position at a company, a scholarship, a letter of recommendation, at the bottom of the list of decision-makers there was always some name connected to the old world. A business partner who once worked with Ted, an acquaintance of Vernon's, a benefactor with indirect ties to Anita. Fairmont Crest was like an invisible net that kept tightening around her, making her realize she had never really left. She was just moving around inside space that the adults in that place had defined long ago. The shock of learning the truth about her identity didn't make Eva more grounded. It pushed her into a path of self-destruction. She started drifting into short-lived relationships where she used her body both to prove to herself she still existed and to punish herself for ever believing she could be someone's legitimate daughter. Endless nights out, mid-range bars, apartments that smelled of smoke and alcohol, impulsive decisions. All of it blurred together into a smeared timeline where she stayed just sober enough to work, then sank back into cheap distractions. Somewhere, she could hear echoes from Fairmont. She's just a bastard we used to milk Ted. She tore apart a family and then ran off. Instead of fighting back, she chose to live exactly like the labels they'd slapped on her, as if carrying out her own sentence. If she was going to be judged, she might as well become everything they hated, so she would never again have to try to live up to anyone's expectations. She was both victim and executioner, carrying out the punishment on herself. Back at Fairmont Crest, Eva's story was quickly twisted into vicious gossip. People said she ran away out of shame, that she had taken advantage of Ted and finally showed her true colors, that she was proof that anyone outside the proper order who tried to push into their world would eventually be thrown out. Ted heard those comments at parties, in hallways. Sometimes he pushed back, sometimes he stayed quiet, but it always ended with him drinking more than he should. He kept an eye on credit reports, secretly asked people to check if Eva was using any cards linked to him, but he never stepped outside his comfort zone to actually go look for her. Partly because he feared she would reject him, partly out of cowardice, partly because deep down he still liked to think of himself as a victim of Leslie's lies, not someone truly responsible. Nicole was different. After the truth came out, She had once stood on Ted's front steps. Staring down the road, Eva had rolled her suitcase along, torn between getting in her car to go find the girl and returning to the new life she had painfully built after the divorce. In the end, her pride as a woman who had been betrayed won. Nicole decided that girl didn't deserve another second of her time. She didn't call, didn't text, didn't ask anyone to look for her. But years later, when she heard that Eva was still alive but had sunk into a shadowy world, Nicole finally understood that her silence that day had also been a knife, one that helped push Eva further over the edge. Years went by. The younger generation of Fairmont Crest grew up in homes filled with unspoken rules, where every meal was a performance and every mistake was magnified under the lens of public opinion. One of them, maybe the child of Danny, Naomi, or another branch of the family, happened to meet Eva in some distant city. They didn't recognize her because of her last name, but because of a look, a facial line they had seen before in old photographs or half-told stories cut short by the adults. In the eyes of this new generation, Eva was no longer the homewrecker, but a mystery, a buried story. When they encountered her in real life, they didn't see a dangerous person. They saw a woman with tired eyes, a strained smile, and unsteady steps in the neon glow of a nightlife district. That mixture of rebellion, freedom, and poorly hidden sadness in Eva accidentally pulled the young person into her orbit. They were curious. Why were the adults so afraid of her? What had really happened to turn a Fairmont princess into someone wandering with nowhere to belong? When news of this encounter made its way back to Fairmont, the community was once again forced to look at what they had done. Ted had to face the truth, that he had not only lost the image of the daughter he once loved, but had allowed the darkness around her to spread to the next generation. Because he refused to take responsibility, another child now risked being drawn into the same spiral of self-destruction that Eva lived in. When Nicole heard that one of her own grandchildren had been pulled toward Eva's world, she realized that her choice to cut clean years ago hadn't been a solution at all, but a flight disguised as decisiveness. She understood that by denying Eva any space to explain, by refusing to see her as an individual with her own existence separate from Ted's mistake, she had helped push the girl to believe she didn't deserve to be saved. Leslie sank into a twisted kind of guilt. She pitied Eva, resented her for failing to succeed, according to the script she had written, and feared that the return of her name would finally expose every calculation she had tried to hide behind the mask of motherly love. The story became more and more tense as the entire community had to ask itself, how had Fairmont Crest created Eva, and were they now repeating the same pattern with the younger generation? The security gates, the high walls, the council meetings, the charity galas. These things were all built to prove this place was a symbol of success, order, glory. But behind them were children growing up feeling like projects, investments, political cards rather than human beings. Eva was just the first case to crack, the first visible fracture on a flawless glass surface. The new child who found Eva in the shadows now stood at a crossroads. They could return to Fairmont and erase it all as a misstep, or they could keep moving deeper into Eva's orbit, seduced by the thrill of rejecting every old rule. The turning point came when Eva realized she now held the power to decide that young person's fate. She could drag them down with her, teach them how to live on the fringes, how to burn everything down so there would be no more expectations to bear. It would be the perfect revenge, making Fairmont taste the same loss of control, forcing Ted, Nicole, Leslie, and everyone who had turned their backs on her to witness a new version of the old tragedy. But the closer she grew to the child, the more Eva caught glimpses of her younger self, naive, desperate to be seen, willing to trust anyone who made her feel like she belonged. The question that haunted her every night was no longer, why did they lie to me? But, am I becoming the kind of person who destroyed me? To pull someone else down with her, she would have to accept that she was no longer just a victim, but an agent replicating the very violence she once suffered. In that inner struggle, Fairmont Crest loomed again like a ghost. When Ted learned Eva was still alive but living in the dark, it began to haunt him to the point he could no longer sleep peacefully. He hired people to search discreetly, asked questions through financial channels, but every step forward collided with his fear that, when they finally met, Eva wouldn't see him as a lost father figure, but as one of the many who had helped push her here. Nicole stood on the thin line between protecting the new generation and facing the past. She wanted to stop her grandchildren from having anything to do with Eva, but she knew that the more she forbade it, the more she drove them toward her. Leslie, the self-proclaimed architect of Eva's future, now had to watch her creation stand as living proof of how a wounded child warps when they are never allowed to heal. She felt guilty, but even that guilt was shaped by selfishness. She feared being dragged into the light more than she truly feared for Eva. When Eva found herself standing before the possibility of returning to Fairmont Crest, not as Ted's daughter but as someone carrying the evidence of all the wrongs they had committed together, the story grew far beyond DNA results or Leslie's confession. It became a question about the responsibility of an entire community toward a child who had been broken long ago. If she went back, she would have to face Nicole and Ted, not to beg for forgiveness, but to tell them exactly what had turned her into who she was now. If she didn't, if she chose instead to pull another young person into her darkness, Fairmont would have one more excuse to comfort itself with the lie that the problem lay in spoiled individuals, not in the system itself. The tension lived precisely there. Eva knew that no matter what she chose, she could never return to the moment before that DNA envelope was yanked out of the file all those years ago. The only choice left was whether she would end the chain of betrayal by taking the darkness and refusing to pass it on, or send back to Fairmont exactly what it had sown in her life, but multiplied by dragging the next generation into the same hell. In that moment, all her rage, all her humiliation, all her abandonment, all of Leslie's guilt, all of Ted's cowardice, all of Nicole's cold pride knotted into a single weight on Eva's shoulders. And no matter what she chose, no one at Fairmont Crest would ever again be able to pretend that Eva was just a personal mistake. She was the distorted mirror reflecting everything they had done, or failed to do. When a child once looked up and asked, "Who am I in this world?"